Ethical and sustainable are probably two words you hear regularly in a variety of contexts. There is a consensus that we, as individuals, workforces, communities and nations, should employ sustainable habits that are considerate of ethical standards. But how does that relate to finance? As Jersey's biggest industry, finance has seen a huge uptick in these types of conversations. Matt Falla and Ian Leverington of Evelyn Partners join me again for today's episode of Money Talks, and together we'll delve deeper into this topic and its relevance. So, what does an investment have to be considered ethical or sustainable, Ian?
Ethical is more about exclusions, more about not putting things in a portfolio. So it's things you won't invest in. Sustainable is a more inclusive term. It really means investing in good companies, good portfolios, or companies that are trying to be good, and without giving up the returns that you should expect from a normal portfolio.
What we can see is that ethical can be quite a subjective term at times. So what is ethical to one person might not be ethical to another. Yeah. So I think there are generally industry standards in investment management that says that this is investing ethically. I would also add that there's almost no occasions when we try and investment managers seek investments that aren't sustainable.
Yeah.
You want a company to still be existing in 12, 24, hopefully 120 months' time. But sustainability does look more towards the earth, and are the practices of that company actively damaging the world that we live in.
Yeah. So leading on from that, what would be an example of investing or an investment that is not ethical or sustainable?
Yeah, as I said, not ethical is really about excluding certain asset classes from your portfolios. What we see a lot, very commonly, is no fags, no guns. So no investment into cigarettes, no investment into armaments. But you could include in that list, and people do include in that list, things like gambling stocks, companies involved in pornography. Nuclear is a contentious issue, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Yeah. But often an ethical decision would be to not have any nuclear exposure as well. Not sustainable it's a much more nuanced answer. I guess the way to the classic example of a stock that's not sustainable would be an investment into the coal sector. Coal, huge carbon emitter, dirtiest of the fossil fuels. And from a sustainable perspective, there are two reasons not to invest in coal. Firstly, it's a polluter. And sustainable world, a world for your children's tomorrows, you don't want to be investing in something that's going to make the earth uninhabitable in 30 years' time. The other point is, from an investment perspective, you don't want to be investing in coal because there's a really good chance that at some point in the future you'll be told that coal is not allowed to be used in the production of energy in a country or globally. If you're investing in coal, at that point you have an asset in your portfolio which the value of which has just gone down to zero. You can't sell it. You have to write it off. You make a permanent loss in your portfolio. So a good investment manager would be thinking on two levels. Firstly, does it make sense from a long-term perspective globally for the planet? And does it make sense for an investor to have that investment? So that kind of frames the two sides of what it means to be a sustainable investor.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because that's what came to mind for me. There's kind of two sides to the sustainable coin, where if the activity isn't sustainable, the business doing it isn't sustainable either. So it's really interesting to have that perspective.
I wish I'd have said it that neatly.
Well, that's what I got from you, so I can't take too much credit. Matt, anything to add on that?
Yeah, and I think it's always interesting how the view on what is ethical, sustainable can change. I mean, a key point is the war in the Ukraine. You know, we could have taken an ethical stance, and rightly so, that armaments are bad, and we don't want to see those. But if you're defending freedoms and you're defending oppression, then that does unfortunately require armaments. So The definite, and if we also look at the impact in terms of sustainability, it's arguably some of the historically biggest pollutants and damagers of the world that are spending the most amount of money now on changing their practices for a cleaner future. So avoiding those investments in companies that you might look at as dirty might actually remove capital funding from those businesses that are doing some of the most to improve the world that we live in.
That's really interesting. I never thought of it like that. So moving on to the why. So why is it important that these kind of investments are made? Ian, we'll start with you again.
Wearing my environmental hat, global warming is a fact, regardless of what Donald Trump in the US will tell you, that it's all cyclical. It's a fact, it's man-made, so humans have had an undoubted impact on raising global temperatures 1.5 degrees higher than pre-industrial levels, to a dangerous level. If you don't believe me, believe the United Nations. They set up an intergovernmental panel on climate change back in 1990, which started to look at the fact that it was becoming evident that global warming was putting the planet and our lifestyles at risk. The latest report in 2022-23 really highlights it. I'd recommend it as a bedtime read for anybody who wants to understand the scale of the problem. This isn't just opinion. These are some of the greatest climate scientists in the world working for the United Nations, and this is the conclusion that they've made. If we carry on at this rate, we're not talking about reversing global warming. Even at these levels, we're likely to see, and we've started to see, in fact, more extreme weather occurrences, a huge loss of biodiversity in the world already, and that has an impact. If the bees die, we die. And for a sustainable investor, it's important that governments can do their bit. Governments can set regulations. Governments can make investments into renewable energy, for example, and the UK is very good at that. The difficult thing is getting the money to go to it. Most of the world's assets are held privately, and getting that money into a system where you can reduce carbon emissions, you can freeze global warming, and look to make a more sustainable planet and a more sustainable business practice. That comes from the money, and to a great extent, how we as investment managers allocate that money and what companies we allocate it into, and why. I mean, sustainable investing should be good for the planet, should be good for investment returns, and should be good for society. And that's kind of our job as sustainable investors.
Yeah. Matt, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing to add is that, individuals are by nature individual. And it is arguably some of the effects of privilege that for certain countries and certain individuals who have the luxury of wealth or are already developed, that they can at times look at other countries and say, you need to do better as well.
Yeah.
If we look at the fact that, in some of the emerging nations, and not that China is emerging, but China has lagged behind some of the Western world in terms of the use of power stations, and now that is driving a huge amount of economic growth in those countries. So for the Western world to go, no, you've got to stop that now, and you're just catching up, is somewhat can be somewhat rude. And I think certainly as well, for an individual who's worried about putting food on the plate, arguably where that food has come from is far less of a concern than is there any food at the same time. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us, especially when we're looking at managing money in this way, to ensure that it's being done in the right way and it's not damaging to the planet that we all depend upon.
Yeah, excellent point. Let's move on to the when. So when did the concept of ethical and sustainable investing come into focus? I ask that because I'm curious if it kind of, the growth and prominence of it or popularity has been kind of consistent with the growing conversations around general ethical and sustainable practices. Would you agree? Is that kind of a matching trend?
Without doubt it is. I mean, ethical investing has happened since 1500s, and you could argue it's happened for a lot longer than that. Whether you have Muslims not investing in money lending, for example, or Methodists not investing in the slave trade in the 1700s and 1800s, or Quakers not investing in weapons. That the ethical approach to investing has been around for a long time. The sustainable approach to investing is a lot more recent. I mean, after the Second World War, you had a kind of pick up in socially responsible investing, where people said, look, we understand that we'll give up some of our returns to do good in our investment portfolios, which is commendable, but wasn't widely adopted.
Yeah.
Sustainable investing kind of hit the headlines, as it were, became more mainstream after the first IPCC report in the 90s. Then you saw sustainable development goals introduced in 2006 again by the United Nations, trying to make it a better and fairer world for all. And then the principles for responsible investment were created in 2015. Again, a UN prerogative that tries to get all investment management to look at their investment in a certain way, to understand very deeply what their companies do, to work together to put pressure on companies who are bad planetary citizens to behave in a better way. So, for example, putting pressure on oil companies to set targets for carbon reduction, that sort of. So, they kind of go hand in hand. Government regulation and industry regulation has made investment managers move more towards the approach that they need to include non-financial factors in assessment of a company's value. So, 40 years ago, you'd look at a company and say, what do we think its earnings are going to be for the next 2 years? Mm-hmm. You wouldn't think, how would global warming affect how this company gets its stuff to market? Yeah. If it's coming overseas, or if its supply chains are damaged by climate change, or its workers aren't able to work because the temperature's too hot for them to do so. So, it's kind of part at a company level. It's becoming a necessity. At an investment level, regulations and guidance kind of lead to the same conclusion. Yeah,
and for you, Matt, in your experience?
Yeah, and I think Ian touched on before that 40, 50, 60 years ago, you'd have to give up. It was sort of an ethical premium or an ethical discount, I say, to investing. You would give up something in terms of being ethical and good. Now, because the whole investment management industry and global corporate practices are far more ethically and sustainably driven, you're not going to notice any give up in investment returns as a result of that. It was a while that I would often look at, there was a vice fund out there that was almost the antithesis of ethical and sustainable, that invested in everything that you didn't want to invest in, but again had some relatively healthy returns at different times. So I think we're seeing, and it's a really interesting point on the religious overlays as well to this, where how this is coming into line with how some people have always invested. It's now that it is the norm, and it's mandated for the good of the planet, not just your own internal beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think how is up next, and it's how can people be certain that they're making an ethical and sustainable investment? Ian, we'll start with you again.
I really wish there was an easy answer to this question. One man's sustainable is another man's pariah, if you like. A great example is to look at the oil sector, the energy sector. You can take two stances. You can either say, I don't want to invest in oil majors because they pollute the earth. The sooner they stop, the better. And I refuse to invest in those. The other stance is that you say, well, if I'm not a shareholder, I don't have a voice at the table. I can't work in concert with other shareholders to enforce a structured reduction in carbon emissions. So, and this is just at the moment, it's a terrible example because BP have backtracked very significantly from their original stance. But 3 or 4 years ago, BP were convinced by their shareholders that they ought to have a plan, targets to reduce carbon emissions by 2030 and by 2050, and a plan to move out of carbon production into renewable energy production. And they started investing into renewables as an alternative. So, are you sustainable by investing in it, or are you sustainable by not investing in it? And that's an important question. I think if you have leverage, our view is if you have leverage, you should use it. You should act in the best interest of your shareholders over the long term, and you should put pressure on companies to reduce carbon emissions. Probably the buzzword of the day is greenwashing at the moment. It seems to be an excuse for people not to invest in sustainable assets. It's just greenwashed, and you see some of the problems. Even just selecting between two different companies can be difficult if one reports on their carbon emissions and one doesn't. If they both report on their carbon emissions, but one of those companies hasn't had it audited, so you don't know if they're just making up those numbers. You don't know what's included. Ratings agencies. There are a number of different companies who will tell investors how sustainable a company is, how good their practices are. The problem is there's no commonality between those different companies as to what represents. So one ratings agency could say, "Yeah, this is a really good company. We give it a high sustainability score." Another company could score it far lower.
Yeah.
So there's that lack of information it makes it harder to tell what a good sustainable investment is. There are things. There are. I mean, first of all, do your own research, I guess, is the answer. We certainly do that at Evelyn Partners. We speak to the company, we look at their sustainability reports, and we check it, see if it's true. We want to see things like science-based target initiatives, which means it's been audited and somebody else externally has said, yeah, that plan works. That will reduce your carbon emissions in line with 1.5 degrees Paris Agreement targets over the next 10 years. So that's what we're looking for. There's also some taxonomy in Europe. So if you have a fund that you say is sustainable, you've got to explain to European regulators why it's sustainable. You're either saying that we include sustainable issues in when we're choosing stocks, or you say actually we actively go out to buy only sustainable stocks. But you've got to prove that. So governments and regulators are starting to try and stamp out greenwashing. Yeah. And that's important.
Yeah, I think it's amazing how capitalism will find industry around anything, even things that are deemed to be ethically and altruistically good. So if there's money in something, if there's money to be made from something, then you can find often there's areas of corruption within even the best meaning of activities. And certainly you have seen this with the large-scale planting of trees in places where trees should not be to get carbon credits and various other things. And indeed, even trying to deal with the things that seem easy, such as the carbon emissions of the airline industry, but things that are very difficult to deal with, such as the carbon emissions of the shipping industry, which far outweigh those, but are far harder to deal with because we need to get stuff around the globe. Mm-hmm. So I think it comes down to, much like anything we do personally, do you recycle? Do you buy ethically food? Do you make decisions around what you eat and what you put into your body? You will do the same sort of things. If you can't do that individually, then you find someone that you trust professionally in a well-regulated environment, and you put your faith in them to invest money as to your wishes.
Well, that moves perfectly onto my final question, which is the who. So who are the best people to talk about ethical and sustainable investing with? Who are people, like you say, the trusted individuals? Where can you find them?
I mean, honestly, first of all, speak to your investment manager. They should know. Any investment manager worth their salt nowadays should have a good handle on how the portfolio is allocated and whether it's allocated sustainably or not. And they should be focusing on these things because it's in the best long-term interests of the guy they're investing the money for.
Yeah.
Interesting, the Jersey Finance website, lots of information on that about sustainable investing, both locally and conceptually. Study the subject, read around it. Probably the biggest disconnect is that the finance industry is actually getting up the curve, but the guy in the street, it's quite hard to access more information like that. So, Mike Berners-Lee, well-known writer on climate, he's just released a book called Climate of Truth. Read that. There's a book by Eric Lonergan called Supercharge Me, which I think I'm about the only person in the world who bought it. But it's fascinating in terms of, it's rather like this, a discussion of how best to make changes most efficiently on a global scale. What's sensible ideas to get us to our targets we're trying to achieve. If you're in the finance industry, and there are lots in Jersey who are, then you can simply study the CFA or the CISI. Both offer courses that teach you about the issues involved and what your responsibilities are and what you should do. And then just get involved. Go online, find out what's going on locally, find out how you can get involved. It's really important that everybody does. Yeah,
absolutely. Matt, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd just say do what you can if you care about this subject. And whether you have the money to invest and then you find someone you trust who can invest that money ethically for you, or as we all do on a daily basis, we make decisions on what we do with our capital, which is either our monetary capital or our time capital, and you make that, whether you decide to shop in a certain place or go and use an honesty box from some of our organic growers, whether you decide to recycle or not recycle, do what you can. And often there are times when, especially in this space, probably when we've talked about diversification in terms of ethical investing, yes, but if you have a small amount of money, some of the amazing schemes that, let's say, Durrell do, or the organisation at Scoop, are doing a massive amount there. So I think, do what you can if it means something to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, lots of brilliant insights there. Thank you to the both of you once again.